I joined Reddit today pretty much to tell this story, though I'm a lurker on a ton of subreddits, so it's just nice to have an account now. I've told the story to my roommates, who are from the same town, and I've talked about it a few times with some of the people who were there, but that's it. I don't even like to talk about it because inevitably someone will say, "Really? We should go try and find it again." And I really don't want to. I've looked for it on a map a few times, but I can't find it, though my male friend who drove there that night swears he has the directions memorized through Google's aerial maps. Anyway, I'm originally from a major city in southern Ohio, and outside of town there are a number of smaller townships. One of these is known as the more country bumpkin, redneck, grit part of town. It's not even in the same county, but is part of the general area my city is though of as. In the woods there's this legend of Hell's Church, supposedly an old church that burned down where Satanists do rituals now, or a Satanist church that burned down by a ritual, depending on who you ask. There are a number of Hell's Church myths in Ohio in many different places, but this one was closest to us, and a number of my guy friends decided they wanted to be ghost hunters and check out haunted places around where we lived. We were juniors in high school, and while all of us obviously thought this was just stupid bullshit, we thought it was funny to go out and scare ourselves. Plus, most people had cars or driver's licenses by now, so we were enjoying a new burst of freedom. I'm a scaredy cat about most stuff like this, but I was the most tomboy-ish girl in the group, and always kind of wanted to be able to hang with the guys, plus some of the girls in the group, who I was closer to, were going, so I didn't want to look like a loser or a pussy. So one day in November, we decide we are going to go out one night and try and find this church. We had actually been to this location once before that fall, but one of my friends had a curfew, so after exploring an old barn and the railroad tracks on a bridge nearby, we left. We hadn't found the church, supposedly just a chimney at this point, to our disappointment and my mild relief. We took 2 cars out there, going past more populous parts of our city and back to this woodsy area. I can't honestly tell you how we got out there, but I know it's off a state highway, then an abandoned access road, past some old warehouse, and then down a dirt road. Once you get down the dirt road, there's a kind of thicker part of the road early on where we parked cars off of the shoulder. We did this because the road thins out and becomes impossible to drive down. And also, someone clearly owns this land, and later down the road there is some no trespassing signage. I'm sure a ton of kids come back here, so it didn't seem odd to me that they wanted to block this place off. I barely thought twice about it at the time. We get out of our cars and start walking down the dirt road, wandering off the path from time to time to check out barns or clearings where we thought the chimney might be. At first, it was just scary because it was dark and old or whatever, but then the barns started to get weirder, like they were filled with weird spray painting symbols and bullshit, but that's not what bothered us. We figured whoever was there before us did it, which I still 100% believe, but also other stuff, like dead owls that looked like they had been opened up, though they were dried out and decomposed by the time we got there, thank God, and other bits that looked like they might have come from animals. I was grossed out, but we all kind of agreed that these probably came from the same teenagers trying to fake a satanic ritual, or that the animals got trapped in the falling apart barn and died in there to be picked apart by other animals. My friends are now hardcore trying to find this stupid chimney, so they keep taking off through the trees into clearings. Myself and the other 2 girls who were there kind of hang back on the tree line for most of them, getting a little more nervous and a little irritated with all the coming up empty. As we keep going, we find a bike on the tree line, like a bike that maybe a 12-year-old would ride. That's a little creepy, but fine, whatever. Probably belonged to someone who owned the land. We decide we are going to go a little further, and soon enough, we find another bike. This one is older, a little rusted, but still undersized. We didn't talk too much about the other bike, just kind of mumbling that it's probably still nothing. 1 or 2 of the 4 guys who, where they're kind of trying to tump it up, saying, these kids probably got murdered or stuff like that, but no one is really having it. By this point, we've been here for about 2 hours, and it's getting really late. Plus, I think we were all a little more creeped out than we wanted to admit. We decide to head back to the cars, and I'm feeling relieved, happy to be headed back to my house and the fuck out of here. But things never work out that way, do they? By the cars, we see a road that goes straight up a hill through the trees. At the start of it, there's a big metal gate that had a road closed sign on it, which we had seen before, but for some reason it had never occurred to us to try and go up the road. We had a small debate at the gate about an evenish split on who wanted to venture up and who didn't. I absolutely didn't, but eventually we decide we'll go up, just to see. Both of the drivers want to go, so there's not a lot we can do about it. We climb over the gate and start up the hill, where our old pavement road is cracked and crumbled under our feet, though it was for sure a real asphalt road at some point. In addition to the road condition and the brush being an obstacle, someone had felled a bunch of trees over the path, purposely blocking off the road from any cars. Some of us are starting to seriously question if we should be doing this, arguing that someone obviously wanted to keep us out of here, but we get teased for being afraid and keep going. I couldn't see where the road would end because it was so dark. We had a few flashlights, but it wasn't doing us much good, and the tree made it hard to see. Plus, the road was super steep, so all you could really see was up, with a little moonlight peeking through the trees. All of a sudden, though, we reach the end. The trees just open up, and we have come off of the incline to a flat field. And holy fuck, what a sight it was. It's the flat field with tall prairie grass on either side, probably 2-3 feet high, and pretty uniform. The path we are on splits the large clearing we are in down the center and leads through the grass to a cul-de-sac with 3 buildings. 2 look like they are farmhouses, with 1 barnish building. They were wood, and while they may have been painted at one point, it looked like they had been mostly weathered and stripped by time. I see this, and I am done. I want to leave. But of course, some of my friends say that we have to check out these buildings. At this point, I finally put down my foot, as do the other 2 girls and one of our guy friends, who decided this is enough for him. He was our valedictorian, so maybe he was just smarter. So the 3 guys who want to go to the buildings tell us just to wait there, and while we don't want to be in this field out in the open, we decide we can't just leave them. At this point, we've turned off our flashlights because the moonlight is so strong. The 3 of them take off down the little path, and the 4 of us who remain stand together, bitching about how stupid our friends are and making small talk. None of us say it, but we are all looking to the grass every now and again, worried something is going to jump out. It's just so creepy, this abandoned little settlement. It feels like our friends are gone forever. We see them get to a building and go inside. It was unlocked, I guess. We can see the flicker of their flashlight lights in the windows, and I just remember feeling so tense. It was like watching a horror movie in real life. After maybe 10 minutes, though it could have been just a tense 5, we see our guy friends coming towards us, lightly jogging, looking afraid for the first time all night. "You idiots went inside?" I said, pissed off at them. One of my friends just looks at us, and I'll never forget it. It was full of bikes, just bikes chained to the walls. We didn't believe them, kept waiting for them to say they were kidding, but they insisted, said it was like they were just storing a bunch of bikes there, most of them smaller. They looked afraid, and as much as I didn't want to believe them, I did. They aren't the type of guys to pull a prank for this long. By then we can all agree we need to get the fuck out of there, and we start down the hill, hurrying the best we can. All of a sudden, about halfway down the field, we can see a car's headlights down the hill, about where our cars are. We see them pass slowly, and we know someone is down there looking for us. Because it's so far off the beaten path, we figure it's one of 2 things. 1, the cops, and we are going to be fucked for trespassing. 2, the people who own this land or these houses or something, and they are going to A, call the cops, or B, murder us. We know that the road isn't that long, so they'll be turning around, circling back soon enough, and because our cars are there, they'll probably wait for us. We are all whispering about this as we pick up the pace, sprinting down the hill as fast as we can. I'm not a good runner, but I was hauling ass, getting down as fast as I could, basically hurtling over the fallen trees. Once we get down the hill, we don't see any headlights, but we know they can't be far away. "Get in the fucking cars," one of our friends yells, and we are fumbling with the doors like a horror movie, just too nervous to get into the cars. We get in, and just as we start the cars up, we see the headlights speeding down the road, a giant black truck roaring up behind us. The truck seemed larger than life, raised up off the ground. The whole thing was terrifying, but extra terrifying was that we couldn't see who was driving in the dark, and with the headlights blinding us. We peel out of there, total pedal to the metal. This truck is still following us, bearing down on us as our two cars race out of there. The car is also getting real close to us, threateningly close, almost like it was trying to run us off the road. We're all screaming, looking back at the truck, fighting for some distance. Once we get to the highway, we are switching lanes, trying to escape. Luckily, we were in sedans, so it was easier for us to weave in and out of cars. But this truck is still chasing us. We are in two different lanes, but don't want to get too separated from our friends. The passengers of both cars are texting back and forth, trying to make a plan. It took us about 15 minutes to lose the truck. I'm not sure if the distance was too much, or if they turned around, but once we got to a big shopping center area, we ducked off the road and into a Sonic parking lot. We all sat in our cars for a little bit, watching to make sure we weren't going to get snuck up on before getting out of the car to get some food and talk. Everyone, even the guys who had tried to act tough the whole time, was pretty shaken up. It took us a while to settle down enough to head home. As much as we talked it over, we just couldn't figure out what had happened. Eventually, we all went home, during what was a pretty silent car ride, exhaustion and lingering fear taking over. We didn't talk about it again for a long time, and we never called the police, which, honestly, as an adult now, I feel like we should have. I don't think about it often, only during the fall, really. But when I do think about it, I ask myself, who chased us? Why was that town abandoned? Who owned those bikes? And where are they now? I'll preface this by saying we were 12, 13 at the time, and my friend and I often snuck out of either of our houses during sleepovers for late-night walks. This was the basis of this terrifying encounter, and it stopped us from ever sneaking out after dark again. My friend lived opposite a huge forest, so her house was the preferred choice to sneak out of, for us to roam around at night, because the forest was more scary and thrilling, and we always took flashlights, food, and blankets so we could camp out for a couple of hours before going back home again. Well, on this fateful night, we inadvertently fell asleep instead of staying awake, so when my friend suddenly jolted me from sleep, it was past 3 a.m., a lot later than we usually snuck out. We grabbed our essentials and creeped out of the back door into the cold and dark night. Frost crunched underfoot as we crossed the deserted road, and as we reached the entrance to the forest, we noticed how it was pitch black and completely silent it was. Unnervingly so. We turned on our torches and stepped onto the uneven path into the forest, the light illuminating the trees swaying in the icy wind. We stepped on fallen sodden leaves and bark as we made an unsteady but familiar way into our favorite part of the forest, our cold breath the only noise to invade the deafening silence. We reached the small hut we constructed one afternoon, made entirely of sticks purely for the purpose of having some shelter for our campouts. There were times that vandals or other kids damaged our hut, but for the most part, it stayed intact. But on this occasion, it was completely destroyed, like a harbinger of worse to come. We were just deciding to just call it a night and come back later on that day to repair the hut when we heard it. This loud, shrieking giggle that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My friend and I jumped in shock and looked at each other like, what the fuck? We were completely freaked out. The eerie and unnatural giggle rang out again, contradicting the silence and making my body break out in goosebumps. "Someone is in here," my friend whispered to me, looking utterly terrified. "We have to go now." Her voice of rationale made it even more scary and unnerving to me that someone was in the forest with us at 3 o'clock in the morning. We just looked at each other in assent and took off running in unison, our footsteps navigating the path as naturally as we could from muscle memory, our uneven gasps of air punctuating the giggling that seemed to be following us, getting closer and closer. Our torch's light went up and down, with our fast movements illuminating random patches of the trees and bushes as we finally saw a small sliver of light as we came to the forest entrance. Running out of the forest, we didn't stop until we reached the back door of my friend's house and almost collapsed in a breathless heap of relief to be safe. Then, my friend's eyes went wide and she nudged me, pointing a shaky finger to the across the road. A haggard woman of indeterminate age was standing at the forest entrance, giggling that awful, horrifying giggle, and was waving over at us. We screamed and ran inside and looked out of my friend's bedroom window through the smallest gap in the curtain and could still see the woman standing there. Worse yet, she was staring right at us as if she knew we were there. We could tell she was still giggling that hideous, appalling laugh. She turned very slowly and walked back into the forest again. We never went back to that forest, nor went out after dark again. This happened when I was growing up, around 2004 or 2005, when I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area, a good ways outside the town of Uvalde, Texas. The town itself was really small back then, and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres, I think, down outside of that area, and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but also gave us some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down there from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfy, I hated it. All had to do was either stare out the window or try and beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I was never able to accomplish in my youth lull. The drive, obviously, took most of the day so we got there in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it that year yet, and the cabin in the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I had been in scouts for a couple years and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it, so after unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough, dust and dirt everywhere, flies. I remember that it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit and getting the sleeping bags out, then setting up the cots, we decided to sleep. Something about that night was weird. I never was able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guessed was an hour, maybe. When we woke up, it was early, about 7 a.m. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs, and find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer and horribly hot in the afternoons, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came to an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs. Typical torn-up ground where they had been rooting, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. Some of their body was blocked by trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got to the lease that nobody was there, not to mention the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some bright-colored red jacket. We slowly walked toward them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunters. This is private land." The person didn't move at all, dead still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that he was turned away from us with his hands in his pockets. Weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and what looked to be ski pants. Now this is Texas in the summer. It was about 98 outside by then. My dad called out again. No reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnap the clip to his pistol holster. That's all we had at the time since we were only scouting the area. The rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side, and then my dad told me to stay put about 20 yards away. I stayed and crouched down, watched him circle around to the frome of the man, all the while talking to him, asking if he was okay. He finally passed around to the frome of the man, and my dad stood straight up with a confused look on his face. I called out and said, "What's wrong?" And he called back saying it's a mannequin. I walked over to it while my dad stood there staring, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, sap, bird droppings, or signs of being outside for more than day at most. At that moment, I looked at my dad and could see him get worried. Almost immediately after, I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, and I knew my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly so scared. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying to hold back panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity, but in reality was only about 45 minutes max. After returning, we packed up and beat feet. We drove back home that day and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he had never had an issue with people because his property was high fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but me being young and the lease possibly having someone there we didn't know about. He decided to be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked, and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling, but didn't want to wake me up because he thought I was sleeping too. Turns out that next week he got a call from his buddy and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone. No mannequin or anything. That story still makes my hair stand on end. No idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks it was some kind of trap or something. Not the creepiest thing that happened to me in the woods, but definitely top 3. So whoever was out there, I'm glad we never met. I could give you a million times as a kid, and young adult I felt scared or paranoid playing in the woods. It's a beautiful place, and I spent my entire childhood getting lost, not literally, out there by myself or with friends. As kids, we never got too far out there, but you could actually see the progression of us venturing further and further out as we got older because of forts and carvings we would leave. This one particular time, like 1,000 times before, my friend and I had just graduated high school. It was our last summer of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camping and hiking out there. We had decided to try and find a new place to set up camp and walked for what felt like a few miles before we came to a nice clearing. The area was relatively new to both of us. We got the camp set up and fire going, and the plan was to wait until nightfall, smoke some weed, and play Monopoly. For sake of backstory on my friend and I, my buddy is a smaller, real goofy guy, but comes from a family of foresters and always had a deep understanding of all the trees and different plants you came across. He had no fear of going and camping out by himself. If I spent 10,000 hours in the woods, he probably spent 50,000. As for me, I'm a taller, sturdier guy, and as we got older, I spent more time worried about women and sports, and the woods became a place for small parties. Also, I never had the balls to camp out alone. In fact, older me wouldn't go far at all when I was alone because I could never shake the feeling of being watched, which was just paranoia, but still an uneasy feeling. Anyways, camp is set, fire is going, but it's getting lower and needs wood. Sun is down and we're both cutting up and having a good time. My friend is sitting on this little chair he always brought and loading up this makeshift bong, and I was crouched breaking some excess limbs off some of the logs we had gathered for the fire. All of a sudden, this strong breeze cuts through the clearing. I couldn't tell you if it was the suddenness of it or what, but my friend and I both stopped immediately and looked at each other. The breeze went just long enough to flicker our fire down to a small flame. We both sat completely still in almost total darkness. Neither of us said a word. Across from us on the other side of the fire, we could hear footsteps. They sounded like somebody was running and would slow to a walk and then run again, definitely on two legs. By the sound of it, they were pacing back and forth over the same spot. Then, just like it started, it stopped with a softer crunch on the underbrush. I knew by the sound it had taken a crouch. I was crouched still and knew I was staring right at it in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and said, "Buddy." And when he did, I felt this surge of fear come over me. I could feel it and hear it in him. I had been so fixed on the footsteps and rationalizing what I heard that I hadn't even considered being afraid. But this was true fear. It was raw and made me feel helpless. I could hear my friend after a while grab some leaves and he dropped them on the fire. For the split second the leaves covered the fire, we were in pure darkness. Then the fire sprang to life. We both quickly grabbed more leaves and brush and threw it on the fire. I got some sticks and logs on there and neither of us took our eyes off the spot or moved much for over an hour. Finally the leaves crunched and it slowly walked off. Whatever it was had sat crouched watching us without moving for far longer than any animal would. It wasn't until after the footsteps disappeared that I realized the smell had disappeared as well. It smelled like a paper mill, spoiled eggs almost. For the rest of the night, besides whispered remarks, neither of us really moved or stopped looking at the spot. Nobody went into the tent and I had very short light sleep sitting on the ground with my head rested on my hands. My friend never went to sleep. In the morning, we packed up and silently walked back home. To this day, we talk about it. In the 7-8 years since it happened, my forester friend has not camped by himself out there since. In 2016, I was working as a private investigator in rural Oregon. Most people make the stereotype that private detectives and investigators have walk-in clients, but that simply isn't true. I get almost all of my cases from clients by phone, and the call I got in that June was no exception. The client, a man named Jonathan Alexander, was calling about the disappearance of his father, Sergio Alexander. Jonathan's father had gone missing ever since a solo deer hunting trip in the backwoods of our little Oregon town, and the search parties and official parties hadn't turned up anything. In most cases like this, you're looking for a body in the woods, not a live person, but Jonathan was hopeful, so I gave him the benefit of the doubt. In this case, I took my go bag. A duffel bag and its contents were a bottle of water, a first aid kit, my Taurus Raging Hunter, a bag of Ziploc bags, my wallet and phone, and food. A Taurus Raging Hunter revolver might have been overkill, but I was planning to go into the woods, and the woods can be a dangerous place. This part of Oregon was stocked full of cougars, mountain lions, bears, wolves, moose, and some others, and almost everyone carried a heavier firearm when going into the backwoods. The first place on my schedule was Jonathan's house, where I would meet him in person and have an interview. As I pulled up into his dirt driveway, I got a sense of the kind of person he was. His house was a 25-foot trailer stuck to the ground, with a backyard and patio facing the mountains. "Are you Jonathan?" I asked the man waiting for me. He was tall, at least 6'5", and wearing a checkered button-up, a trucker cap, and jeans. "Yeah," he replied. "You're Inspector Jacob, right? Come inside. I'll tell you the details. I also have some things that could help you, depending on how willing you are. I walked inside the trailer, and the interior was everything I expected. The walls were lined with taxidermied bass and catfish, as well as several mounted deer heads and rifles propped up on display. A dirty kitchen with piles of dishes was one corner, and a small two-person dinner table. Jonathan, John for short, and I sat down. Jonathan offered me a beer, but I declined. I never drank on a job. I started with the regular questions. Where was he last seen? Who was with him? What happened leading up to the night of the disappearance? John replied, telling the whole story. My dad, Sergio, was a hunter and fisherman. Hunting and fishing was his life. He always had a rifle or a fishing rod. He's in his 60s and was in the military for 7 years, had a few tours in Afghanistan. On that night, he wanted to go solo buck hunting in the evening, so I dropped him off in a dirt road near his favorite spot. He didn't come back for 2 days. This was somewhat normal. He sometimes hunted overnight or just got lost. After a week passed, I got really worried. I could feel that something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. I called the sheriff, and they organized a search party for 3 nights. We went in every direction, covered all the ground, and you know what? Not a single thing. Not a candy bar, no footsteps leading past his spot, no trail, nothing. After he was declared deceased, I went out myself to search. I know he's still out there. I know it. And where is this dirt road? John marked the road on the GPS on my phone, and I thanked him and left. I had a no solve, no pay rule, so I wouldn't get paid unless I actually found Sergio, dead or alive. My next stop was at the sheriff's office, in the middle of my small town. I drove past multiple roadside stores until I reached the parking lot of the sheriff's office. I parked and walked into the place, going up to the front desk where a tall and skinny deputy was doing paperwork and chewing gum, presumably as a substitute for cigarettes. I told him that I was looking into the disappearance of Sergio Alexander, and he sent me to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a balding man in his 50s named Clyde, showed a forced smile as I walked inside. A stained American flag was pinned to the wall, along with dozens of missing person posters and wanted posters. So, Inspector, is this missing guy a friend of yours? He asked. No, I replied. A client wants me to find him. Sergio is the guy's dad. Well, you're in luck, Clyde replied. We haven't gotten much criminal activity, so I can show you some of the search party reports. Clyde reached into his desk and pulled out a stack of papers and photos, which I flicked through. One of the photos captured an image showing a trail of footprints, ending abruptly. And what is this? I asked. It's the strangest part of the case. The footprints leading to Sergio's favorite hunting spot just stopped. No trail leading somewhere else, no tire tracks, no ATV tracks, nothing. It's like he just up and vanished into thin air. I sighed. This case was going to be a hard one. What else of interest was there? I asked, looking through the files. Clyde pulled out a satellite image of the woods, with a Sharpie written on the spot where Sergio had gone missing. This is the entire area in which we estimate that Sergio could have walked around in the time he was gone, Clyde stated. We checked every bit of it, and guess what? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But there was one thing we found of interest. Which is? I asked. There was a pattern. Every time we checked a place, we heard Sergio's radio coming from somewhere. I raised an eyebrow. Sheriff Clyde continued, but it was very, very faint. Could barely hear it. And another strange thing was when we went to search for Sergio, in the entire area where he went missing, all the birds and animals were quiet, even the crickets. As soon as we left the area of the supposed disappearance, the sound all came back. I checked the watch. It was early evening. After jotting down all the notes I could gather, I thanked the sheriff and left. My next stop, the woods. By the time I pulled up to the dirt road in my pickup truck, it was well into getting dark. This wasn't the ideal time for me to search through the area and find clues. Every detective knows how important the first 45 hours are. The place was exactly as John had described it. It was extremely rural, just a few miles away from a mountain range, and it was completely silent. The forest should have been alive, with birds chirping, wild turkeys moving about, crickets chirping, but the night was dead. Turning on my headlamp, I found Sergio's footsteps from when he was last seen and started combing through the area. Just like Clyde and Jonathan had said, the trail abruptly stopped in the middle of the woods. Nothing, no other signs that Sergio was even there. It was as if he just up and vanished. Suddenly, I heard some rustling behind me. It was fully dark by now, and nobody should have been there beside me. The sound came again, except it was now in front of me, but just out of the reach of my headlamp. "Who's there?" I yelled. "Show yourself. I'm armed." For dramatization, I flicked the revolver holster from my Taurus on my belt. Suddenly, something tapped me right on the back. I didn't have time to pull out my gun, and considering that whoever was doing this was probably some drunk guy, I wouldn't need it. I turned and threw a Mike Tyson haymaker in the thing's direction, and ended up hitting a tree and nearly breaking my wrist. In the split second that I was proud of my Mike Tyson haymaker, I realized that I had punched a tree and that my knuckles were actually bleeding. Whoever was behind me, if there was someone behind me, they were long gone. And that was when the laughing started. Actually, it was more like cackling. Weird, crazy, and unnatural cackling. Whatever you'd call it, it was unsettling anyway. I pulled out my revolver designed to drop bears and fired a deafening shot into the air. The laughing everything stopped for a bit, and I almost put my guard down. Then I heard something whisper just an inch away from my ear. It said, "Leave this place," and the next thing I know, I hear the sound of a million running footsteps catching up to me, and I GTFO. I ran right out of the woods, fast enough to outrun Usain Bolt. Adrenaline is one heck of a drug. I jumped in my pickup truck, turned the engine, and peeled out of there, all in record time. Whatever was behind me was still chasing me, behind the car. I looked into the rearview mirror to try to look at the thing, which was running at least 80 miles per hour to keep up with me, and I saw nothing. Well, it wasn't a conceptual nothing. It was nothing in the sense that it was nothing my brain could comprehend and understand. There was a huge, blurry shape running after me, dark as the night, and fuzzy around the edges. It was as if somebody took a huge mass of static from an 80s TV, made it into some sort of creature, and put it on a dirt road at 9 o'clock to chase some poor private investigator. I turned the road, drove down the road until I reached the town. The thing was, obviously, gone. I parked at a gas station parking lot and threw up once my body realized how much running I had done. The next day, I headed to a woman named Meredith's house. I had heard about her from when I was at the bar the night I saw the demon thing, by some paranormal junkies who were particularly interested in what I said. Meredith apparently owned a tea and plant shop at the edge of town, having the shop based on the first floor of her house. She also knew a thing or two about paranormal entities, the occult, monsters, ghouls, and... well, you get the gist. I pulled up into the driveway of her shop and knocked on the door. "We're closed, asshole." Somebody, probably Meredith, yelled. I looked at the store hours taped on the front door. Today was a Friday, and according to her, probably outdated, store hours chart, she was, as a matter of fact, open. "You're open, so stop being lazy," I yelled right back. Meredith groaned and opened the triple-locked door. In person, she was a short Latino woman with long black hair and a purple beanie, and wearing a trench coat and jeans, which was totally not suspicious. "What do you want?" she snapped. "What I want is to know what is in those woods. And lady, don't piss me off. I'm still on a hangover. You study the paranormal and supernatural, or am I wrong?" "No, you're not wrong." "Good. Because yesterday I got bullied and chased by some weird demon thing. while looking for a missing man in his 60s. Meredith's face went pale. I taught myself how to learn and read expressions people make, and by the looks of it, she knew exactly what I was talking about. Come in. I might be able to help you. Like Jonathan's house, I was easily able to tell the interior of the house from the inside. There were plants everywhere, on the walls, growing in giant pots on the floor, as well as shelves stocked full of beakers and test tubes, and a few bags full of strange substances. I sat down on a worn-out couch while Meredith assessed my situation. "First of all, who told you about me?" she asked. "Some British fellow named Ron," I said. But then again, I was drunk, so he might have been a John or Bob. "How did you say this thing looked like?" "Big, dark, blurry. I couldn't actually see it since it was at least 100 feet away, but it was running 80 miles per hour, whatever it was. Huge, must have been over 20 feet big." "Did you look at it directly?" Meredith asked. I answered plainly, "No. I looked at it through the rearview mirror, and even then I couldn't see it well." "Must be why you're alive." "What was that?" I asked. "What you just described is what we in the business call nagalakuis." "Nagalakuis?" I muttered. "The heck is that?" "No one really knows," Meredith replied. "He, she, whatever a nagalaku is ancient, has been in these woods for probably over a century, and no one knows where he came from. You said that you were looking for a missing guy, right? Well, Nagalaku probably took him. Nagalaku might eat him, might let him go, might keep him for eternity, I don't know. Then how do I kill this thing?" I asked. "I need to close this case." "You probably can't," Meredith said. "But whatever you do, don't look directly at Nagalaku, or your mind will literally melt at the unfathomable horror, and you will die. Do not look at it." "Don't look at the demon thing," I said. "Gotcha. Do you have, any herbs or materials that will stop Nagalaku from hurting me or doing anything?" "Yes, actually I do. It's white ash blessed by a shaman. If you sprinkle it over yourself or any weapons you have, it should be more effective against any supernatural being." Meredith stood up and walked towards a cabinet and pulled out a large Ziploc bag of white ash, which seemed to glow and vibrate, and she handed it to me. "This ain't free," she said. "It's $100, I sighed, and reached into my wallet and pulled out $100 in cash and handed it to Meredith in exchange for the white ash. "Hey," Meredith called out as I packed up my stuff and headed for the door. "Yeah, be careful." Like that was even possible. I got out of there and drove to the gas station, where I planned to get my supplies to hunt Nagalaku and find Sergio Alexander. But before that, I needed to fuel up. I bought incendiary rounds for my revolver that the gas station surprisingly sold, and I ordered pineapple pizza while listening to Piano Man by Billy Joel. After I finished up and threw out my garbage, I had devised a plan which involved flares, a bottle of vodka, a huge jug filled with gasoline, and a Molotov cocktail. The cashier, a guy named John, seemed very interested in the thing I bought from the gas station. He was a tall guy in his 50s, with a graying beard, a trucker cap, and a military attitude. "What are all these things for?" he asked, as I heaved the heavy gasoline tank onto the counter, along with some other flammable and extremely dangerous things. "Oh, nothing," I answered, trying not to sound suspicious. "Just trying to take care of a pest problem." But John didn't see that as nothing. "You're going into the woods, ain't you?" I was caught off guard at how easily and accurately he knew what I was doing. "Yes," I replied. "Well, I'm off work after this shift, so I'll come with you. Or I could just report to the police that a private investigator is buying suspicious amounts of flammables and gasoline, along with 45 Magnum incendiary rounds for a Taurus Raging Hunter revolver." "You Army?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied. "Been in the U.S. Marines and the Navy for a couple of years. Had 5 tours in Afghanistan. I didn't see any reason why John shouldn't come with me. And besides, I could use his military and combat skills, which might be useful, and I wasn't going to carry a 55-gallon tank full of gasoline in the middle of the woods alone. Fine, I said. Let's do this. A few hours later, just as the sun was setting, John and I got out of my pickup truck in front of the woods. John had brought his trusty 12-gauge, packed with Dragon's Breath incendiary rounds, and a mini flamethrower. John would be my backup and the bait, while I carried the gasoline tank duct taped to an explosive Molotov cocktail. The plan was, we would go to the woods, to the spot where I had last been attacked by Sagoth, and wait. Once we heard a sign of him, we would both put on our blindfolds to avoid having our souls sucked out by the unfathomable sight of the eldritch cosmic horror. Ready? John asked. Yeah, I said. Just don't shoot me while you have your blindfold on. We walked into the woods in silence, and after a mile or so, I reached the spot where Sergio was last seen. We sat there and waited an hour or so until all the noise suddenly stopped, and I heard the sound of something massive dragging across the forest floor. Put on your blindfold, I said, putting on mine. We can't risk seeing this thing. John nodded, grinned, and put the blindfold on. Whatever it was sounded massive. It said in a demonic and ancient voice, "Leave this place." John and I fired a shot into the direction of the voice, and although my bullet missed by a mile, the old man's shot was a direct hit. Although I couldn't hear it, I saw the light from the blast of fire, sparks and flames coming from the barrel of John's shotgun, and it hit the demon monster. The thing screeched, and we moved back a few steps, still blind, and without warning, the ground opened beneath us. What the fuck? John and I fell into the cavern beneath us, 6 feet. You okay? I asked. Never been better, John replied. What is this place? I lifted my blindfold and looked around to see that we had fallen into a subterranean tunnel that led deeper into the earth. Anyone there? Fucking help! A voice screamed, presumably Sergio's based on the circumstances. We ran down the tunnel and searched for Sergio, and we found the man, lying on the cave floor with a broken leg. We're gonna get you out of here, I said. I heard a screech come from the entrance to the tunnel as Nagalaku crawled down, breaking the walls. I reached down and picked up the tank of gasoline, had my eyes closed, and waited until Nagalaku was just close enough, my heart beating. Get out! I lit the Molotov, yelled at John to take cover, just as Nagalaku got within a dozen meters in our range. I had previously sprinkled the white ash Meredith had given me on the gasoline tank for extra effectiveness, and so that could kill Nagalaku if the explosion didn't. Nagalaku was only a few meters away from us. I lit the gasoline bomb and threw it, and as it exploded, I grinned. Gotcha, asshole. So the funny thing is, a group of redneck hunters found us later. They had apparently found the hole in the explosion crater and investigated. John and I had suffered some mild burns from the enormous gasoline explosion, but the missing guy, Sergio, came out harmless, besides the broken leg he already had before. The redneck family dragged us all the way to their pickup truck, then drove us to the hospital, where we both got treated for our injuries. Sergio was found and reunited after a long disappearance, and Jonathan paid me in the thousands, with the money I didn't expect him to have. When I went back to the place where Sergio had disappeared, and where I had blown Nagalaku high to the sky, I found a very strange, giant, half-human skeleton, where I remembered Nagalaku getting blown up. Sergio Alexander was found, and I had killed one of the things that went bump in the night. Case closed. Don't fuck with the woods, kids.